Hey everyone, and welcome to another terrarium build. Over the past few months I've got a few suggestions that I should make some tiny terrariums. Although I have already sort of done this with the chambered terrarium, I figured I would do it again on an even smaller scale. To begin, I had to find some suitable containers. Luckily, I found all of these tiny corktop containers for around $5 total when I was gathering some materials for other projects. Then I selected a variety of containers from this group to create terrariums with. As always, I like to incorporate a false bottom. For smaller containers like these, I like to simply use some charcoal or activated carbon. Here's some carbon that I had to break up with a hammer so that it was more appropriately sized for this purpose. After doing so, I put it in this container for later use. Now it was time to get my utensils together. For specialized terrarium builds like this, it is imperative that you have a good set of utensils to work with. Here's one of those bamboo skewers that I always use. I wanted it to be a little thinner for these terrariums, so I sanded it down a bit on some rough sandpaper. I then grabbed a couple pairs of tweezers. Next, I had to gather the other materials for this build. I figured I would make these into some tiny native terrariums. That being said, here's some leftover soil from How to Terrarium episode 3. Of course, I also wanted to gather some plants. Luckily, there are a lot of good specimens around my house, and it was an abnormally nice day for this time of the year. Here's a good tip when choosing plants from around your area. If they survive through the winter as the plants seen here, they are almost guaranteed to thrive in a terrarium-like environment. Anyways, here's the selection of plants that I came up with. Now let's begin building the terrariums by adding the carbon false bottoms. This of course will perform all of the functions of your typical false bottom, but it will also purify standing water and keeps the terrarium a little fresher. With a folded piece of paper, I simply dumped some carbon into each container like so. Next, I added the soil to each container using the same method. However, I had to treat this container a little differently than the rest because it is pretty much impossible to keep it standing upright. So I figured I would grab a rock and attach it to the side. To do so, I'm using some hot glue, but I would suggest using silicone for something like this. Hot glue doesn't hold nearly as well as silicone. Now it's time to decorate and add the plants. I have some gravel and twigs that I will use alongside the plants from earlier. Let's begin with the largest container and work our way down to the smallest one. I won't really explain much about how I built each one of these terrariums other than it was difficult working in spaces this small. Now that we've built our terrariums, it's time to add some water. I suggest using something like a pipette or syringe for something like this, but I don't have any at the moment. So to add water to my terrariums, I'm simply going to use some straws. All that you have to do is dunk your straw into the water and then put your finger over the exposed end of the straw. Doing so will create a suction and hold the water in the straw. Now pull the straw out of the water and place it into the opening of your container. After doing so, remove your finger from the straw to distribute the water. Continue this process until you've added an appropriate amount of water to each terrarium. You only need a few drops of water for terrariums of this size, don't overdo it. As always, to finalize these terrariums, I'm going to add some springtails. Here's a lively culture that was seeded back in October. The challenge here is trying to get the springtails into the opening of the container without adding additional water. So to make this a little bit easier, I poured them out into this cup. I then put the springtails into the containers like so. And there you have it, a few tiny terrariums using some native materials.